and put up slides that I'd like to just kind of have in the background while I'm talking. So the first story that I'm going to share is, it's actually not from the Northeast, it's from the Northwest, because I wanted to share a story that had the moon featured in it. And one of my favorite stories that I've told for a long, long time is a Kalispell story. So they're in the Northern Hemisphere, and I'm thinking that the moon they see is pretty much the moon we see. And so that's what I want to share with you. So this story is about a long, long time ago when there was no moon and night times were very, very dark. So when it came evening time and the people had their campfires, they could only see what was just round and about within that circle of firelight. And it was really hard to see what was behind or around the other side of wigwams or make your way down to the stream. They decided they needed a moon, something to reflect the light of the sun when it was nighttime. So they were looking around for volunteers, and the yellow fox volunteered to go up and be the moon. Well, they thought that was a great idea, a nice shiny fur coat. So Yellow Fox went up to be the moon. The only problem is Yellow Fox's fur was so bright that it reflected the sun very, very strongly. And it kept people from being able to sleep all night long. There was just not quite dark enough to settle in and get some sleep. That was nice to be able to find their way around, but it was a little too good. So the people decided that Yellow Fox was not going to make a good moon after all. And they were talking it over, trying to decide who would make a good moon. And Coyote, who's always curious about everything, offered to go be the moon. Well, he had nice, soft, kind of grayish fur. They thought that that would be good, maybe not reflect quite as much light, just enough. So Coyote went up to replace Yellow Fox to be the moon. And, things went along pretty well for a while. The light was much softer, but bright enough to reflect the sunlight so people could find their way around and when they got outside of the circle of the firelight. The only problem was that Coyote is very curious about everything. So he was having a great time from way up high in the sky, looking down and seeing what the people were doing. And then he started doing what he does. He stirs up trouble. So Coyote's looking around and he's going, whoa, look over there. Look at those men who are playing the shell game over there. Look at that one over there. He's cheating. And the guy's going, shh, Coyote, hush up. And then Coyote said, all right. And he's looking around. Whoa, look at that young couple over there. Do their parents know that they're out courting with one another? And then Coyote, stop, hush. Well, it kept on like that. He kept telling about the things that people were doing that they didn't necessarily want other people to know they were doing. He's like, oh, look at that woman. She's taking meat off the drying rack. And she said, Coyote, I put it there. I was just checking on it. Well, that went on and on and on. And finally, they decided Coyote was just not going to be the best moon they could have. So they were deciding who could replace Coyote, and Raven offered. Now, Raven was dark, and they were concerned that it was not going to reflect enough of the sunlight. But, they remembered that when sun hit his wings, the feathers, they would kind of reflect light. So they let him go. And so Raven was up there, and the light from the sun was reflecting off him, but they ran into a problem that none of them had been expecting. The sunlight, when it hit his feathers, there was so much iridescence that it was flashing light all over the place. Nowadays we would almost say that's like a strobe light, and it was just driving the people crazy. So they looked around because they said, oh, that's not going to work. Yellow Fox was too bright. Coyote was too loud and curious. And, the Raven is just making all kinds of light flash all over the place. Who are we going to get? And they looked around, and then they saw Rabbit. Now, Rabbit's fur was nice, soft gray fur, almost the same color as Coyote's. Big difference between Coyote and Rabbit. Rabbit was quiet. So they sent Rabbit up to replace Raven and be the moon. Oh, it was wonderful. Just enough soft light so that people could find their way around. Yeah, it was great. And nobody was telling them what to do or when to do it or telling other people what they should be doing. There were no flashing lights. Rabbit was just nice and quiet. And that's why they say it is from that day until this. When you look up at the moon at night, sometimes you'll see the outline of a bit of a face up on the moon. And that's Rabbit, because he's still moon to this very day. And that's the end of that story. That's how it goes. And I take just a minute to switch to another screen. So that story was Kalispell. It's from the West Coast. This next story is a Wabanaki story. It's credited to the Penobscot people, but it's a story that's told all around Wabanaki territory. You know, the Wabanaki people are the people of the Northeast. It means the people of the Dawnland, or the East, the place where the sun rises in the morning. It's not what the Wabanaki or Abenaki people, same word by the way, call themselves. For themselves, the word is the Alnoba. It means the human beings. So Wabanaki or Abenaki is what other people called the Abenaki people. You know, those people over in the East. So no matter where you were coming from. I think that maybe even where we got down east from, you know, in some ways it makes sense. So the Abenaki people or Wabanaki people, there are 5 nations, 5 tribal groups involved: the Penobscot, the Passamaquoddy, the Mi'kmaq, the Maliseet, and the Western Abenaki. You know, so southern Maine and all of New Hampshire, all of Vermont, and just a little bit of northern Massachusetts, and a little bit of southeastern Quebec. That's Western Abenaki territory. And the rest of Maine and the Canadian Maritime provinces, that's the Eastern Abenaki. So that would be the Mi'kmaq, the Maliseet, Passamaquoddy, and the Penobscot people. But the language, it's all Algonquian language. And so the languages that people speak are very similar dialects to one another, you know, and there were a lot of intermarriages and a lot of trading and traveling. And so there are many, many similarities. And the stories, you know, wherever the people went, the stories went with them, and good stories travel. So this one is about Badger and the Star Wives. One day, Badger and his brother were sunning themselves in a meadow. Along came 2 young women, and they'd been sent out to pick blueberries, but they were idling their time away, talking. They didn't have much to show for blueberry picking. All morning long, they'd been mostly talking and snacking. Well, Badger saluted the girls and asked what kind of luck they were having. None at all, said the older sister. She didn't really want that stranger to think that the fault lay in them. She just wanted to think that there were not that many blueberries available. Well, Badger said, "You're not looking in the right place." And he's kind of hiding a grin because he's a troublemaker. And he said, you should follow the sun to its going down place over in the west. And there you're going to find more blueberries than you ever imagined. Quick, 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 said the younger sister. Let's go. Let's go and find them before somebody else does. So away the 2 sisters went. Well, Badger started laughing, and his little brother's laughing too. Badger's, when they find the sun's going down place, it's going to be too dark. They're not going to be able to see blueberries or anything else either. Well, the 2 girls followed the sun all afternoon. And when it dipped below the treetops, they looked for berries in the dusk. Of course, it was the dusk. It was getting dark. They could hardly see anything. Not one berry did they find. And then at last they realized that they'd been fooled. Badger had tricked them. And they knew that they need to build a lodge so they'd have some shelter for the night. And it was too dark for them to travel back to their village. Luckily, even very young Wabanaki women are taught how to build a wigwam, because that's the woman's job to do that in the culture. So the sisters stripped the young birch trees, good tall ones, off the boughs, took the boughs right off them. They thrust these birch saplings into the ground in a circle, and then they bent them toward the center and tied them off. So it made kind of a cone shape. And then they covered that cone shape with some birch bark and even put some more saplings on the outside to hold that birch bark in place. And then they went and got lots of boughs from the spruce tree and put them inside to make a soft place for them to sleep. And then they settled down. And when they laid down with their heads toward the door. so they could look out and look at the night sky while they were talking till they fell asleep. If you could marry a star, the younger girl asked. She was sleepy. Which one would you choose? That large bright star or that small twinkling one? And her sister yawned too. Oh, the large bright one. And then the sister fell asleep. I think I'd like the little one, said her sister. And then she drifted off to sleep too. Well, the next morning, the older sister woke up first, and she cried out in surprise because there was a young man with big, beautiful eyes standing right in their wigwam. Whoa! He said, you wished for me, and here I am. Well, the two girls were absolutely astonished. They didn't know what to make of this. They didn't even remember their sleepy wishes from the night before. But they understood that this man and his brother wished to marry them. They thought the men looked kind and that it would be very nice to have husbands to love and care for them. So they agreed to go and live with the men in their own country. Turn around 4 times, said the younger man, with your eyes tightly closed. And the girls did that. And when they opened their eyes, they discovered they were in a strange new land. It was wide and open, no trees or water or a blue haze over everything. The girls thought it was beautiful, and they settled down happily with their husbands, sharing one large wigwam. Now, the men were kind to them and gave them all they wanted, but warned them to never look under a certain flat stone that was pretty near their wigwam. Now, of course, this immediately aroused the girls' curiosity. Time after time, they'd look over that stone and they'd ask each other, what could be under that? Why can't we look? Well, at last, one day when their husbands were off hunting, the younger sister just couldn't stand it any longer. I'm just going to take a little peep, she said, and she lifted the stone. Well, to the sisters' amazement, they found themselves staring down through a peephole at the earth itself, as if they were eagles. They could look down on the green forest and the lakes and the rivers, their own land. And now at last they knew where they were. They were in the sky with stars for husbands. And all at once, they were homesick. They'd seen their home and were reminded of it. Well, that night when the husbands came home, they saw that the girls had been crying. And they guessed the reason. And just as they had feared, the earth women wanted to go back to their own people. Very well, the star husbands said sadly. If you want to go, we'll show you the way. Go to sleep, said the younger man. And when you wake, you'll find yourselves where you were when you first wished for star husbands. Wait till you hear the chickadees sing, said the older man. But don't open your eyes. Wait until you hear the red squirrel singing, but even then, do not open your eyes. Wait until you hear the gray phoebe sing, and then you may open your eyes. Well, the star wives slept for a long time, until at last they began to hear familiar sounds in the forest. With closed eyes, they heard a chickadee song. Don't move, said the older sister. Then the red squirrel sang, and the younger girl she couldn't stand it. She couldn't wait any longer. So she threw off the blanket. No, said her sister. Wait till the gray phoebe sings. But the younger star wife had already opened her eyes. Well, this time, the star wives were no longer in the sky, but they weren't on the ground either. They were way up in the topmost branch of a white pine tree, halfway up to the sky and halfway down to the earth, because they hadn't waited. And more than that, because they'd been disobedient, well, they'd both turned into weasels, not girls anymore. Well, the older girl really wanted to scold her younger sister for being impatient, but she knew that wouldn't help. They had to get down. They had to get down from that tree. Hey, look, there's the moose, she said. Let's ask for help. Moose, Moose, cried the younger sister. Help us. Well, what will you give me if I do, said Moose. Anything. You could even choose to marry one of us. Moose just shook his head. No, thank you. I'm already married. And he went on his way. Well, next came the bear. Oh, bear, save us. One of us will marry you. I was married in the spring, said the bear, and he went along and passed on his way too. Then came the marten, and he just laughed at them. I don't want to marry a weasel, he said. I'll choose my mate from my own kind. And he too passed along. We ought to have stayed with our star husbands, moaned the older sister. We've been really foolish. Yeah, said the younger one. She was finally learning some wisdom too. It's better to live in the sky than in a tree. Look, said the first one. There's that rascal, that one who tricked us in the first place. And sure enough, there was Badger, looking up at them with a mocking grin. However, he didn't recognize the girls he'd fooled because, well, to him, they looked like ordinary weasels. What will you give me, he asked, if I help you down? The girls said they only had themselves to give. And Badger said, well, that's just what he wanted. What he had in mind, though, was 2 roasted weasels, not live ones, not one for himself and one for his little brother. He wanted supper. Tie your hair string around the branches, the older star wife said to her sister. She didn't really trust the Badger this time. I'll do the same with mine. So both women took the strings of rawhide from their hair and they tied them in many, many knots around the branch of the tree. Well, Badger went up and he carried the elder sister down first. And she told him that after he brought her sister down, he should go back up the tree again and bring down the hair strings because they were very valuable and had magic in them. Meanwhile, she said, my sister and I will prepare a wigwam for you. Well, Badger willingly went up the tree because if those hair strings were valuable, he wanted them for himself. But they were tied in many hard knots, and it took him a long time to get them free. And while he was busy at this, the sisters were very busy building and furnishing a wigwam. At last, Badger came down, and they crept out the back way from that lodge and ran for their lives. The fun's over, cried Badger, drawing his knife. Now for a good dinner of young weasel, and he strode into the wigwam. Ouch, he cried. Sharp thorns ran through his moccasins. Help, he shouted as he bumped into a hornet's nest, and the angry insect stung his face. Oh, he moaned as he stumbled over an anthill, and the ants ran over him and bit him. The girls had prepared the wigwam very well. Now, by this time, Badger had escaped from the wasps and the ants, washed his stinging body in the brook, and he was really, really angry. He made up his mind no matter what happened, he was going to find those weasels and punish them. And it was a simple matter to discover their tracks through the forest, so he started following them. Meanwhile, the 2 star wives are out of breath, and they arrived at a broad river, too wide and too deep for 2 little weasels to swim. Knowing Badger would soon be after them, they were really frightened, and they stared longingly at the other side of the river. And a croaking voice behind them spoke up. It was Crane. The girls accepted his offer when he said, do you want me to fly you over the river? I'll hop on, he said, and away they flew across the water. As he set them down on the far bank, the crane spoke in a different voice, a deep and musical voice full of wisdom and authority. Would you indeed like to be star wives again and live in the sky? Well, the star wives are amazed. How did he know? Sometimes men call me a trickster, said the crane, and sometimes they call me Guskap or Guskabe. Oh, they recognized his name. He's so well known in all the stories they'd heard of him. Oh, yes, they cried, if our husbands will have us back, we would very, very, very much like to live in the sky again. We don't like being weasels at all. Very well, said Guskabe. And he told them to turn around 4 times with their eyes tightly closed until they heard the voices of their husbands. Then the weasels did that. They obeyed his instructions and only opened their eyes when they heard their husbands calling out to them, welcome home, welcome home. And if you look very carefully at the night sky in midsummer, you might see 4 small stars around a piece of the sky in the shape of a wigwam. And these are the 2 sisters and their husbands shining happily up there to this very day. And that's the end of that story, and that's how it goes. Now let me just switch to the next little background slide. There we go. this feeling you're seeing all the little side tiles, but it's okay. I don't think it hurts. So this one is called the Mwababan, the Northern Lights. Well, long time ago, there was a chief named Morningstar. He had a son, only one son, but the son was not like the other young men in the village. And it distressed this chief. He worried about his son because his son wouldn't stay with the other young men. He wasn't interested in the kinds of things that they were doing. And every once in a while, every few days, he would take his bow and his arrows and he would leave the village, head off to the north, and he wouldn't come back for a few days. Well, when he came home, his relatives would ask him where he'd been, what he'd been up to, but he never would answer them. At last, Morningstar said to his wife, I've got to watch my son. I'm going to follow him and find out what's going on. So Morningstar kept in the boy's trail and traveled for a long time. And suddenly his eyes were closed. He couldn't see anything. He couldn't hear anything. Then he had a strange dizzy sensation. And then he didn't know anything at all for a long time. But then his eyes opened and he was in an unknown and brightly lighted land. And he couldn't see the sun or the moon or the stars, but the land itself was illumined with a very unusual kind of light. He saw human beings. They were not like his own people at all. They gathered around him and they tried to talk with him, but he couldn't understand their language. He didn't know where to go. He didn't know what to do. He was well treated by this marvelous tribe, and he watched their games, and he was attracted by a wonderful game of ball that seemed to change the light to all the colors of the rainbow. And he noticed colors he had never even seen before. And the players all seemed to have lights on their heads, and they wore strange belts around their waist. They were rainbow colored. Well, Morningstar took in all of this and was just watching and trying to learn. He couldn't find his son. Well, after a few days, an old man came to him and he spoke to him in his own language, asking if he knew where he was. And Morningstar answered, no, I really don't. So the old man said, you're in the land of the Northern Lights. I came here many years ago myself. I was the only one here from the lower country, as we call it. But now there's a boy, and he visits us every few days. At this, Morningstar asked how the old man had gotten there. What way had he come there? And the old man said, I followed the path called the spirit path, that thing that some people call the Milky Way. Oh, that must be the same path I took, said Morningstar. Did you have a strange feeling? As if you'd lost all your knowledge? You were kind of dizzy while you traveled? Yes, said the old man. And I couldn't see anything or hear anything either. But then I woke up here. Oh, then you did come by the same path. Can you tell me how I can get home again? Well, the old man said to him, the chief of the Northern Lights will send you home, friend. Well, can you tell me, where I can see my son? The boy who visits you, he's my son, and I've been looking for him. Well, the old man said, you'll see him playing ball if you watch. The Morningstar was really glad to hear this. And a few moments later, a man went around to all the wigwams in the village, telling everybody to go out. It's time to play a game of ball. So Morningstar went with the rest. He followed everyone. And the game began. And when it did, he saw the most beautiful lights all over the playing field. The old man asked him if he saw his son amongst the players. And he said, yeah, he did. Look, that one with the brightest light on his head, he's my son. Well, then they went to the chief of the Northern Lights, and the old man told him, this Morningstar, he wishes to go home, and he also wants to take his son with him. The chief asked him to stay a few more days, just to get to know them a little bit better. But Morningstar longed to go home. So the chief of the Northern Lights called together his tribe so that everybody could say goodbye and give their greetings. And then he ordered 2 great birds to carry Morningstar and his son back home. And Morningstar had the same sensations he had had before. He got dizzy. He didn't know where he was. He couldn't see anything. He couldn't hear anything. And then he lost all sense of self until a while later he woke up. His eyes opened. And he saw his wife, and he saw all his relatives. He saw his son, and they told them all about the land of the Northern Lights beyond the spirit path, and how they had spent time in this strange and wonderful place that if they looked to the north, everyone else might be able to see once in a while too. And that's the end of that story, and that's how it goes. So that also was, I think it was started as roots in Penobscot lore, but it traveled all around. This story is actually from our neighbors, the Iroquois people, and it's attributed to the Cayuga, but it's known all throughout Iroquois country, and some parts of it have come into Abenaki territory too. So there were 4 hunters who were brothers, and no hunters were as good as they were at following a trail. Boy, they were really good at tracking. They never gave up once they began to track their quarry. One day in the moon, when the cold lights returned, cold nights, an urgent message came to a village of the 4 hunters. A great bear, one so large and powerful that they thought it must be some kind of monster, had appeared. The people of the village whose hunting grounds this monster had invaded were afraid. Well, the people, they couldn't let their children go outside the village anymore to play in the woods. The long houses of the village were guarded each night by men with weapons who stood sentry at the entrances. And each morning when the people went outside, they found huge bear tracks in the midst of their village. And they knew pretty soon this bear was going to become very, very bold. Picking up their spears and calling to a small dog, the 4 hunters went out forth to the village. It wasn't that far away from them. And as they came closer, they noticed how quiet the woods were. There were no signs of rabbits or deer or even the birds. The birds were silent. On a great pine tree, they found scars where the great bear had reared up on its hind legs and made scratches to mark its territory. Well, when they measured it, the tallest of the brothers tried to touch the highest of those scratches with the tip of his spear. And it was so high up, he couldn't even reach the top of the bear scratches. Oh, it's just what the people feared, the first brother said. This one we hunt is the great bear. He's a monster bear. Well, what about the magic that the monster bear had, said the second brother. And the first one said, that magic is going to do us no good at all if we can't find its tracks. Well, that's true, said the third brother. I've always heard from the old people that creatures can only chase a hunter who has not yet found its trail. And when you find the tracks of the great bear and begin to chase it, then it has to run away from you, not towards you. Brothers, said the fourth hunter. He was the fattest and laziest of the 4. Did we bring along enough food to eat? Because, it may take us a long time to catch this big bear, and I'm feeling kind of hungry. And they just ignored him. Before long, the 4 hunters and their little dog reached the village, and it was a sad sight to see. There was no fire burning in the center of the village, and the doors of all the longhouses were closed. Grim men stood on guard with clubs and spears. There was no game hung from the racks to dry, no skins stretched for tanning. The people looked hungry. Well, an elder sachem of the field came out to the field, and the tallest of the 4 hunters spoke to him. Uncle, he said respectfully, we've come to help you get rid of the monster bear. And the fattest and laziest of the 4 brothers spoke up. Uncle, he said, is there some food here we can eat? Can we find a place to rest before we start chasing that big bear? I'm tired too. His brothers just kind of ignored him, shook his head and smiled. My brother's only joking, Uncle. We're going to go now and pick up the trail of that monster bear. I'm not sure you can do that, nephews. The elder sachem said, we've tried to find the tracks, and they come closer and closer to the doors of our lodge each morning, but whenever we try to follow the tracks, they disappear. Well, the second hunter knelt down and he patted the head of their small dog. Uncle, he said, that's because they do not have a dog such as ours. He pointed to the black circles around the eyes of the small dog. 4 eyes here, he can track. everything, anything, even tracks that are many days old. Well, may the Great Spirit's protection be with you, said the older Sachem. Don't worry, Uncle, said the third hunter. Once we're on the trail, we never stop following until we finished our hunt. That's why I think we should have something to eat first, said the fourth hunter, but the brothers just didn't listen to him. They nodded to the elder Sachem and began to leave. Sighing, the fattest and laziest of the brothers lifted up his long spear and he trudged after them. Well, they walked following their little dog, lifting up its head. It kept lifting its head and looking around with its all four eyes. The trail was not easy to find. Brothers, said the fattest and laziest hunter, don't you think we should rest? You know, we've been walking for a long time. But his brothers didn't pay any attention to him. They were used to him. Though they didn't see any tracks, they could feel the presence of the great monster bear. They knew that if they didn't find its trail soon, it was going to make its way behind them, and then they would be the hunted ones. Well, the fattest and laziest brother took out his pemmican pouch. At least he could eat while they walked along. He opened the pouch and he shook out the food that he'd prepared so carefully by pounding together strips of meat and berries with maple sugar and drying it, putting it in to carry for food. But instead of pemmican, his hand was filled with pale, squirmy things that fell out of his hands. And well, the magic of the great bear had changed the food into worms. Brothers, said the fattest and laziest hunter, let's hurry up and catch that big bear. Look what it did to my pemmican. Now I'm getting angry. Well, meanwhile, a pale, giant shadow, the great monster bear, was moving through the trees close to the hunters. Its mouth was open as it watched them, and its huge teeth shone. Its eyes flashed red, and soon it was going to be behind them and on their trail. Well, just then, the little dog lifted its head and yelped. Hey, the first brother called out. Four Eyes has found the trail, shouted the second brother. Well, we have the tracks of the great bear now, said the third brother. Big bear, the fattest and lazy one yelled. We are after you now. Well, fear filled the heart of the great bear for the first time, and it began to run. And as it broke from the cover of the pines, the four hunters saw it, a gigantic white shape, so pale as to appear almost naked. With loud hunting cries, they began to run after it. And the great bear's strides were long, and it ran more swiftly than a deer. The four hunters and little dogs were really fast, and they didn't fall behind. The trail led through the swamps and the thickets. It was easy to read because that bear was huge and it pushed everything aside, even knocking down big trees. On and on they ran, over hills and through valleys. They came to the slope of a mountain and followed the trail higher and higher, every now and then catching a glimpse of their quarry over the next rise. Now the lazy hunter was getting tired of running, so he pretended to fall and twist his ankle. Brothers, he called, I've sprained my ankle. You must carry me. So his three brothers did as he asked, two of them carrying him, taking turns, while the third brother carried his spear. They ran more slowly now because of their heavy load, but they weren't falling any further behind. The day had now turned into night, and they could still see that white shape of the great bear ahead of them. They were at the top of the mountain now, and the ground beneath them was very, very dark as they ran across it. The bear was tiring, but so were they. It was not easy to carry a fat and lazy brother. The little dog, Four Eyes, he was close behind the great bear, nipping at its tail as it ran. Brother, said the fat and lazy one, put me down now. I think my leg's gotten better. Well, the brothers did as he asked, and he was fresh and rested. Then he grabbed his spear and he dashed ahead of the others. And just as the great bear turned to bite at the little dog, that fattest and laziest hunter leveled his spear and thrust it into the heart of the great monster bear, and it fell dead, just like that. And by the time the other brothers caught up, the fattest and laziest bear had already built a fire and was cutting up the big bear. Come on, brothers, he said, let's eat. All this running has made me hungry. So they cooked the meat of the great bear, and as its fat sizzled, it dripped over the flames. They ate. Even the fattest and the laziest one was satisfied, And then they leaned back in contentment. And just then, the first hunter looked down at his feet. Oh, brothers, he climbed, look below us. And the four hunters looked down, and below them were thousands of sparkling lights. In that darkness, they realized it was all around them. We aren't on the mountaintop at all, said the third brother. We're up in the sky. And it was so. The great bear had indeed been magical. Its feet had taken it high above the earth as it tried to escape from the four hunters. But their determination not to give up the chase had carried them right along up that strange trail behind him. And then the little dog yipped again a couple of times. The great bear, said the second hunter, look. And the hunters looked, and there, where they had piled the bones of their feast on the great bear, it was coming back to life. It was rising to its feet. And as they watched, it began to run again, that small dog chasing close on its heels. Follow me, shouted the first brother. And grabbing up the spears, the four hunters again began to chase that great bear across the skies. And so it was, the old people say. And so it still is. Each autumn, the hunters chase that great bear across the skies and kill it. And as they cut it up for their meal, the blood falls down from the heavens. It colors the leaves of the maple tree scarlet. And then they cook the bear, and the fat dripping from their fires turns all the grasses below them white. And if you look carefully into the skies as the seasons change, you can read that story right up there in the stars. The great bear is the square shape some call the bowl of the Big Dipper. And the hunters and their small dog, you can barely see the dog, are close behind. And they're right behind the Dipper's handle. And when autumn comes and that constellation turns upside down, the old people say, oh, that lazy bear, lazy hunter has killed that bear. But soon the moons pass, the months go by, and the sky moves once again towards spring. And as it does, that bear slowly rises back onto its feet, and the chase begins again. And that's the end of that story, and that's how it goes. You know, something I miss when I'm telling stories over Zoom is the being in person with people. We usually use a call and response phrase, and you're going to hear it from me in the next story that I tell, which will be the last story. It's one of my favorites. This is a story that is very, very old. Here in the Northeast, you know, the Wabanaki peoples and all of their cousins up and down the East Coast, but here in the Northeast, we have a 12,000-year ongoing presence. And so the stories, some of them are hundreds of years old, but some are thousands of years old. And this story that I'd learned about 35 years ago, I learned from a teller who had learned it from a teller, who had learned it from a storyteller, who had learned it from a storyteller. And I had never seen it written down anywhere. About 20 years ago, I recorded it. And finally, about 10 years ago, I saw a children's book that was sort of looked pretty close to following the track of this story. But it's still, you know, it's become very popular here in the Northeast, even though it is, to the best of my knowledge, a Lenni Lenape story. So this story, it happened so long ago, so early in the world, that the animal people were much bigger than they are today. And this is before the two-legged, such as you and I, came. And the animal people, they could talk to each other. And one more thing, it was daylight all the time. It was a beautiful blue sky day. Kingfisher, he was sitting up on the branch of a tree, and across the river from him, Otter was just sunning herself on the other side on the bank. And suddenly between them, a big fish jumped up out of the water. And at the same moment, Kingfisher swooped down from his branch. Otter slithered off the bank, and they both of them, at the same moment, grabbed an end of that fish, and they started pulling and tugging. And Kingfisher was flapping his wings and pulling one way, and Otter swimming for all she's worth and pulling the other way. And Otter would gain, and Kingfisher would gain, and then Otter would gain, and Kingfisher would gain. That poor fish's eyes were bugging out. Neither one of them would give the prize up to the other. And finally, they got angry. They started yelling, "Hey, that was my fish. No, it was mine." Well, the fish took one look, plopped back in the river, and swam away. And they were so busy arguing about whether or not it was Kingfisher's fish or Otter's fish, they didn't even notice. And pretty soon, over on Kingfisher's side of the river, all the bird people were yelling, "No, no, 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 no. We saw the whole thing. It was definitely Kingfisher got there first. It was Kingfisher's fish." And over on Otter's bank of the river, all the animal people were yelling back, "You do not know what you are talking about. We saw it too, and it was definitely Otter who got there first." Well, pretty soon, on both banks of the river, all the bird and animal people were fighting over whether or not it was Otter's fish or Kingfisher's fish. And the fighting got louder and louder and louder and louder and more violent. And it spread throughout the whole woodlands until it got so loud. Well, Creator noticed. Oh, hey, wow. Creator decided to do something because the bird and animal people, they had nice fur suits or feather suits. They had plenty to eat. There was good homes to live in, nothing to be fighting about. So Creator decided there was something that had to be done to stop the fighting and started to weave. Creator wove for a long, long time until there was a huge blanket, and then took that blanket and spread it across the sky between the sun and the earth, and this pitched the earth into darkness for the very first time. And the fighting stopped because the bird and animal people, they'd never seen darkness before. They didn't know what it was. They were afraid. And you could hear voices calling out to each other in the darkness, trying to locate each other. And they finally, by the sound of their voices, came together in a big council circle. And they sat there in the dark, in the quiet. They weren't afraid anymore because they were with friends. They'd forgotten all about fighting. But they didn't know what to do about this darkness. They didn't know quite what had caused it. They had an idea. And finally, an eagle spoke up out of the darkness and said, "I have strong wings. I have sharp talons. Why don't I just fly up there and rip that blanket away?" Oh, and hey, they agreed. So Eagle left and he circled up and up for a whole day till he came to the blanket that was across the sky, and he sank his talons in and he beat his wings and he pulled and he tugged and he beat his wings all day long until he fell. He was exhausted. He fell down and down and down, and whoop, he landed right in the middle of the council circle. And that wasn't a good sound. They felt around till they found their brother. Oh, they found him. And they sat there for a long time remembering Eagle and not knowing what to do. So finally, another voice spoke up out of the darkness. And that voice said, "I'm Red-tailed Hawk. Like my brother, I have strong wings. I have sharp talons. He must have loosened that blanket. Why don't I climb up there? I'll fly right up there and I will just rip that blanket away." Oh, and they agreed. Hey. So Red-tailed Hawk left and he circled up and up for a whole day until he also came to that blanket across the sky. He sank in his talons, he beat his wings, and he pulled, and he tugged, and he pulled, and he beat his wings all day long until he also was exhausted, and he fell down and down and down. Whomp. This time they knew that sound, not a good sound. And they sat there remembering their brothers, Eagle and Red-tailed Hawk, not knowing what to do. So finally, a big bear spoke up, said, "I'm strong. I'm one of the strongest. I'd go if I could, but I can't fly. What are we going to do, friends?" And a small voice from almost the outside of the circle spoke up and said, "Well, maybe I can help." And the bear said, "I can't see you. Who is that? Who is that over there?" Hummingbird. Hummingbird. Bear knew it wasn't polite to laugh, but Hummingbird, what could you do that Eagle and Red-tailed Hawk couldn't do? And she said, "Well, I don't know, but I'm willing to try." Well, they talked about it in the council circle. Most of them thought it would be a big waste of time. And then finally the bear said, "Look, I don't hear anybody else offering. And like I said, I don't have wings. I can't go. I say we should let her try." Oh, so it was agreed. Hey. So Hummingbird left and she circled up 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. It took her 4 days just to get to the blanket. across the sky because she didn't have the strong, big wings of eagle and red-tailed hawk, her brothers. She had a lot of time to think on the way up. And she realized she had her own unique gift. She had a strong, pointed, needle-like beak. And she came up with an idea. So when she got to the blanket that was across the sky, she hung on and she took her little beak and she poked it through the blanket and pulled it out again. And one single beam of light came through the blanket. And she was encouraged. So she started poking lots and lots of holes. And for every hole she poked, a beam of light came through the blanket. Well, down below, they could almost start to see each other in this twinkling light. They started to sing and drum and dance, and they sent up such a good sound, such a joyful sound that Hummingbird heard them and she got inspired. She started flying all around and about that blanket. She poked thousands of holes till there were many twinkling lights coming through the blanket. She even got inspired and started poking out outlines. And she poked out an outline of the great bear because the bear had stood up for her in the circle. But finally, Hummingbird got tired. And she circled down 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days. And she landed in a circle right next to Bear. And Bear said, Hummingbird, look up, look what you have done. And the hummingbird looked up. Oh, there were thousands and thousands of twinkling lights. So many, they were beyond counting. And this new twilight world, she had made it all by herself with just the encouragement of her friends. And from that time on, there was enough light for the bird and animal people to be able to find their homes again, to be able to find food. And some of them learned how to live really well in this twilight world. The owl's eyesight got very sharp for hunting, and bat learned how to bounce sound off things to find its way around and to hunt. And there were even little peepers that made songs about this new twilight world. And everybody else decided to be peaceful because I remembered what happened last time Creator had noticed them. And then finally one day, Creator noticed the quiet. Decided that enough of a lesson had been taught and took that blanket away from between the sun and the earth, and the sunlight came down. It was so bright, it almost blinded them, but it was warm. Oh, it felt so good. Well, they say that's why it is that from that day to this, for half of each day, the Creator brings the blanket across the sky for nighttime and stars, and the other half of the day takes it away for daylight and sunshine, and how it is that the hummingbird put the stars in the sky. And that's the end of that story, and that's how it goes. Those are the stories that I want to share with you this evening. I kind of had fun traveling through the night sky myself, and also seeing how some of the stories reflect different of the cultural ideas in the Northeast about how things like we got, Ursa Major, the great bear in the sky. Thank you so much again, Cynthia, the Brickstore Museum, for inviting me to tell stories. It's been an enjoying and enlightening experience for me too. I hope you have enjoyed the stories, and I wish you all a very pleasant evening.